Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. Happy New Year. Happy New Year. Welcome back to 2024 to our engaging with diversity, inclusion, and equity training with our, our trainer, Danielle Johnson. Again, please remember to sign in and choose your language in the globe at the bottom. Um, please sign in. We need to capture that. Or you can use our QR code to go ahead and scan that. Inspirational words. If we want to include everyone, we have to help everyone develop their talents and use their gifts for the good of the community. That's what inclusion means. Everyone contributes. All right. So today we're going to be going with privilege and oppression for our training with Danielle Johnson, the conversation catalyst. So I'm going to turn this over to Danielle right now. I'm going to stop sharing. And Danielle, welcome back. Happy New Year again to you,
Thank
ma'am.
you. Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
Let's start sharing my screen. Can everybody see what's on the screen? Awesome. Okay. Fix a couple of settings here because some things change when I share. All right. Well, welcome back. I'm glad to see some familiar faces. Thank you all for continuing to move forward with this series. As shared, my name is Danielle Johnson, and I'm excited to be your conversation catalyst today. What's even more exciting is this is one of the first workshops I'm doing for the new year. So glad to be hopping right back in. And as we know, a catalyst, at least in this space, is we're looking to be an event or person that causes great change. So my hope is the things that you all have learned or honed in the last few workshops last year, you have found some things that you really like and that you're engaging in and that you're creating great change in the place and the spaces that you are in. Because, like I like to say, it's when we log off and start putting things into practice when we start to experience the changes that we're seeking, particularly in the community and the work that we're doing in our households and where we're spending our time. So, as you all may be familiar with, our conversational expectations, again, please feel free to utilize these conversational expectations in your staff meetings, in your discussions, in your homes, whatever that looks like, as you delve into some of the harder concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Continue to keep the door open for ongoing conversation. So, as a facilitator, I do reserve the right to halt the discussion and maintain order, but I'm certain we will be having some really great, robust small group discussions and conversations together with our time. Be present and respectful in this space. So we want to be as engaged as possible. It is easy to lose our focus in training and workshops, particularly when we are now more than ever an on-the-go society. We have 3 and 4 screens up. We have our cell phones and our watches and all the thingamajigs dinging and going off. So I ask that you have respect for your time and what you want to glean from this training and this workshop today by silencing and turning off items as you can. I'd also ask if you're in a place and space to do so, to join us on camera so we can have a little bit more camaraderie with one another. But I also understand if you can, again, if you can be on camera, I would invite you to join us today. You want to lean in to the varying concepts that we're going to learn. And as we continue our journey throughout the year with these workshops, how do we lean into discomfort, get out of our own comfort zones, maybe even out of our own heads and thought processes? We all grew up with certain values, cultures, backgrounds. And oftentimes we need to get into a space where we challenge some of the things that we learned, and continue to embrace those pieces. But how do we lean into discomfort and learn alongside each other today? Wait, why am I talking? Why am I not talking? Some folks need a little bit more time to process, while others already know what they're going to say off the jump. So I ask that if you're someone that is always ready and raring to go, just wait a moment, give an opportunity for others to chime into the discussion. But I do believe that we have a good group that we can engage with one another today for those that might want to be able to share. One mic, one person speak at a time. Land the plane. One of my favorites. Please ask your question. This is still an educational space. We want to create opportunities for folks to show up candidly, vulnerably. It is okay to make a misstep in an education space because the point and the priority is to make long-term change, right? So ask your question, say your statement, and be prepared to be educated by one another in this space. Assume good intent as we move forward. And then also understand that freedom of speech is not freedom from consequence. You still may say something that is seen as rude or inappropriate, and right, intent versus impact. Maybe your impact was not to be hurtful, but it was taken as such. So how do we be mindful with our words while also remembering that this is an educational space? And then stories stay, lessons leave. I hope that you share your own personal stories, but we're not giving license to those that are listening to our stories to share them without our consent or without asking. So please feel free to candidly share your stories, but also understand that we need not repeat other people's stories, but maybe walk away with the principles, the missteps, successes that are shared today. And then lastly, be respectful, and we can always agree to disagree, right? You might not always buy what I'm selling, but you're open to the concept and you're also willing to share your side, your background, how you feel about what's shared. We can go a long way together with the concepts that we're learning today. So again, please feel free to utilize these conversational expectations as your own in the places and spaces that you're in. I want to start with a quote as we are really trying to set our intentions and our mind on the workshop today, which is over privilege and oppression. I'll be thinking about this particular quote that says, "The ease of not being aware of privilege is an aspect of privilege itself, what some call the luxury of obliviousness." Have you ever gotten to a space where you wished, man, I really wish I didn't know that? I would have rather just lived in the oblivious space, right? Because with oblivion comes a lack of um, understanding of a topic or a lack of accountability. And sometimes folks don't want to be called to accountability. That's a hard space to be in. But when you're made aware of something, you can't go back and not unknow it. And that's the tricky thing about privilege is knowing and understanding what our privileges are, how we can do a better job of not being oblivious to what those things are, and how do we share what we can share as it pertains to privilege. So I ask that we all just try to set our minds today on the workshop at hand. It's also important for us to go from the same kind of lexicon, if you will, so our common language, what are we going to be talking about today? Privilege and oppression. Oftentimes words have different meanings, right? Language can be cultural, it can be um, in your area, right? I'm hailing from Wichita, Kansas, so we might say something vastly different than what's being said in the Antelope Valley, right? But there could be some common language. Well, in this space, we want to say that privilege is a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group of people. And then oppression, the state of being subject to unjust treatment or control. I come from the school of thought that we all can experience both privilege and oppression. I also believe that there are some groups and peoples that experience it at a higher rate than others, particularly if you're in a minoritized space, right? Oftentimes, when you see a majority, or if you're a part of a majority, you'll still experience oppression, but that might look and feel a little bit different when you're a part of a larger group that's represented, or when a group has regular representation. So we're going to go into a quick clip. Stop for a second. This video is acting a little funny. Please let me know if you can't hear or see something, and just give a quick overview of privilege.
Privilege is the unearned advantage we get from being part of a dominant group whose needs have traditionally been prioritized. We can experience privilege because of our gender, race, sexual orientation, ability, class, or other identities. Many of us experience a combination of privilege and disadvantages. For example, white women have privilege because of their race, but are at a disadvantage because of their gender. The privileges we have or don't have can have a big impact on our experiences at work. For example, people without disabilities can usually assume that the software their company uses will work for them. But people with disabilities often have to ask whether a tool is accessible, and if it isn't, they have to ask for an alternative. Or consider religious holidays. Employees who observe a dominant religion's holidays, like Christmas, can generally expect paid time off on those days. But employees who belong to more traditionally marginalized religious communities, such as Muslims, may have to use their vacation days to participate in holiday traditions. It's important to remember that privilege isn't something we earn or choose. Privilege is structural. It exists because our society as a whole prioritizes some groups over others. But while we can't control whether we have privilege, we can become more aware of it. That awareness is crucial. If we don't understand that privilege makes it easier for some people to succeed, we might think the more successful group is just working harder.
Here's an example. In corporate America, for every 100 men who are hired into manager-level positions, only 72 women are hired. This isn't because men are more qualified. Instead, it's largely because men benefit from unearned advantages in the hiring process. One study showed that replacing a woman's name with a man's name on the exact same resume increased the odds of being hired by more than 60%. Similar biases affect people of color, LGBTQ people, and people with other traditionally marginalized identities. In another study, replacing a stereotypically black-sounding name with a stereotypically white-sounding name on a candidate's resume resulted in 50% more callbacks, the equivalent of adding 8 years of work experience. And in the third study, when a candidate had something on their resume that suggested they were LGBTQ, such as belonging to an advocacy group, they received fewer callbacks. Remember, in all these studies, the candidates had the exact same qualifications. Privilege, not effort or ability, gave one group an advantage over another.
These examples show why it's so important to understand how privilege shapes our experiences. When we see why women, people of color, and others with traditionally marginalized identities are underrepresented, we can start to address some of the barriers that hold these groups back. But acknowledging our privilege can be really, really tough. It's uncomfortable to admit that we have an advantage we didn't necessarily earn, especially when we've still had to work hard. But when we do start to see the reality of our own privilege, we can also better understand the experiences of people with less privilege. And we can start to find ways to use our privilege to support and advocate for others. In other words, we can become allies.
All right. I like that video because, again, it just provides a quick overview, again, some more common language for us to consider as we think about what it means to have privilege, and really what it means to engage a conversation that is oftentimes seen as an uncomfortable conversation. I've done a lot of different trainings, and I've noticed when we get into privilege, there tends to be a lot of frustration because oftentimes the first thing that comes up is you're saying I didn't work hard when we think about privilege, or you're saying that I'm just being handed things. And in some cases, some folks are just handed things based on privilege, right? Like there's a truth to that conversation as well. But that doesn't negate the work that one does have to do to continue to keep a company going or continue to keep the homes that were passed down, right? There is work involved as well. So we never want to take that away. This is just an opportunity. Can everybody see my screen? Making sure that we're all good there. If I may ask, and if I can get some folks to maybe unmute and share their experiences, if we do have folks on the screen that identify as left-handed, are there any left-handed folks on the workshop today? Okay, we got Carmen. And I don't know if you can actually do this because I know you're doing the translation, but can you share maybe what your experience has been as a left-handed person? And if not, let me know and I can. That pulls you out of the space. It might pull you out of the
Maybe
space.
she can type it in the chat and I can read it.
Okay.
I don't know.
If not, it's fine. Tika's like, you know what? She is in the other space translating. That said, that's just a great example right there, right? One person in here that's left-handed, and or maybe there could be a couple of others, but usually left-handed folks are just in the minority, right? Approximately 90% of people are right-handed. So when we think about how many folks end up actually being left-handed, that leaves you with a very small population or minoritized population. So when you think about at least the right-handers in the space, how many times are you looking for scissors or a desk or how you're eating when you go out to eat and who you're sitting next to and how much space you need? We're probably not thinking about that, right? I'm right-handed, so pretty much when I walk into spaces, things are already set up for those that are right-handed. I'm not asking for additional accessible tools. I'm not, I can pick up pretty much any pair of scissors and keep it going. I'm not running into a bunch of left-handed scissors generally. At one point in time, and this still happens because culturally, there are some cultures that believe that left-handedness is evil or comes from an evil space. Uh, Having been connected to a number of left-handed people, many of them share a similar concept of going to schools and teachers trying to coerce them to be right-handed, family members or caregivers trying to make them use their right hand instead of embracing their left hand. Right, so that's just a very small thing. I see Nancy says I'm ambidextrous, which I think is a really, that's a talent actually, to be able to use both your hands, right? So again, something as maybe as small as that, it's just a way to think about privilege, not just in race, ethnicity, and gender, but the small things, right? And that's generally how privilege works. We're not, those that are right-handed are not thinking about accessibility in that way because everything's already accessible. Anything anyone would like to add from the video that we just watched or even the handedness piece? So identity-based privilege, and then I kind of touched on this a moment ago. When we think about privilege, particularly gender privilege or race privilege, people feel defensive and angry, as if to say, you know, I'm not getting things easier. We all start off at the same place in the world, and we really don't. That kind of parallels the statement of I'm colorblind, right? There's this kind of utopian way of saying we wish we could see everyone as human. Absolutely, that would be great. However, that is not the world we live in. Systems see people. Marginalization is real, and when we understand what that looks like, when we understand that we can have 5 applications and everyone has the same merit and worth on said application, but the only difference is a name. And names can get your foot in the door, or certain sounding names can get you taken out of the pool of applicants. That means that we're not in a blinded society, but we're very much people see identities, people see what's on paper. And so that is very much the point of privilege and oppression. Understand how do we grapple with that and how do we make sure we're not following into privilege in that way. So I want to do just a privilege exploration with folks, and this is where you all will go into your breakout groups. They might be smaller groups, but there's an opportunity for you all just to have a conversation. Here in the chat, you're going to see a list of statements that you will just kind of look and see which ones stand out for you. How has it shown up for you in maybe your own privileges, right? And I will go over a couple. So I'm not usually mocked for my accent. I have never been asked, where are you really from? People refer to me by the right pronoun. My religious holidays are commonly marked on work or school calendars. My parents' caregivers helped pay for my education. My parents' guardians caregivers were homeowners. I don't often worry whether a new environment is physically safe or accessible. So I want you all to kind of think about those statements and pick a couple that stand out to you. And you all will just kind of conversate about what those statements mean for you in your walk, how they show up for you. And then we'll kind of work through some of these questions when we come back. But just thinking about privilege, what's challenging about these statements? What's true about these statements? What's not true? And we will be in the breakout room for about 8 minutes.
Okay. And so Omar is setting up the breakout rooms and Carla. And so when you get those, just you'll be assigned to a room and we'll set the timer.
And I put the statements in the chat as
Yeah,
well, in case.
the statements have
Yeah, right
been dropped.
I'm ready whenever you guys are, okay? Just let me
Okay,
know.
let's do it.
Room one looks like it has a bunch of people, but that's because they moved Carmen and Carlos into the same and Elisa into that room. So
Okay.
they have 3 to 4 people in each room.
And are the questions in the chat? Oh, there they are. Awesome. That's interesting that you say that. I was looking at some of the questions and I'm like, yeah, I did have access. My mom made sure I had access to books and reading materials, and she read to me often. So we weren't extremely rich, but she always made sure I had a library card from the time I was in, I would say, the third grade.
Mm.
And we went to the library every Friday.
Yeah, that's a big deal.
That's a big deal. Yeah, I didn't realize it was, but we went to the library every Friday, and I got books, and I'm still a reader.
Mm-hmm.
Very important.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and then on top of that now, the LA County and I think also San Bernardino counties, they have access to Coursera through the library system. So on top of being able to rent out like books, movies, video games, you can even sign up for courses on there and get certified for different things.
Oh, wow.
It really also helps, the capacity of the parent, not just the child.
hmm And a lot of people are just starting in our community and a few communities out here in Antelope Valley, not all over, but they have the community share where it's a box, like a huge mailbox, but people in the community can drop books in there. And those who
Yeah.
want to read can take those books out and check them out and just read them and then put other books back in. I'm like, that's really cool.
Mm-hmm. We got a
Um,
couple boxes like that too.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's a few.
reading, that's a big thing. Reading comprehension, that's half the battle.
Yeah.
Yep.
My son sent me something online through TikTok, and I was reading that. What I expect chairs or public seating to be comfortable for my body. And my son has sent me this. He said, Mom, now I want to go see this movie. There was a minister who's really heavy set, but he was very pertinent in the civil rights movement. Well, he took his 90-year-old mom to see Color Purple. And because he is handicapped and trying to get his chair because he needs a special chair. They didn't have access for him and they told him to leave the theater. And then they called the police.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I'm like, say what? What?
I don't even
And
know
it was on
how
the
that's
news. He
even
did a
legal.
news conference on it. And I'm like, and it was he was a and when you say I can't remember his name, but he's a civil rights leader during Martin Luther King. He's older now, but he took it. He said, and he came out for rights for people with disabilities. He said you should and never treat people that have disabilities as if. Why would you call the police? I wasn't fighting
Right.
you. I wasn't disputing. I just needed to understand why, in certain theaters they have seating for disabled
Right.
but they did not want his chair or something. It was really weird. And I'm like, and you called they called the police and he did and then he started he's a minister. And he started preaching and said, oh no. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, he took the church. And then he gonna take then there was AMC theaters, and I don't know what part of the country that was in. I think it was somewhere back south. But I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
So when I read that, public seating to be comfortable for my body.
It's a big deal. But right, these are things that we take advantage of. I remember just, and I don't know if they still do this, but if if you're a heavier set person on an airplane, having to pay more.
You have to
If
pay
you're
more
gonna
to
stand
have two
up
seats.
in the other seat, yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's
It's really
yeah.
some interesting things we take for granted. Like we got the week of Christmas off.
Mhm.
We did. I was grateful for it. So thank you very much.
That's a thing that we weren't club, but we're a smaller nonprofit, so we had some days. I can't complain. When I used to work at Wichita State, we would take 2 weeks. Holiday shut down for two
Holiday
weeks.
shutdown.
Yeah.
Yeah, the school shut down during these holidays. Thanksgiving, you get a
Mhm.
week. Or is it 2 weeks? I don't know. Carla,
About a week.
for Thanksgiving, did your kids get 2 weeks or 1 week?
It depends. My kids got 1 week this time around.
Mm.
I think
Okay.
in LAUSD, there was 1 year when they got two.
hmm And for school, okay, somebody just came in. We might want to put them in an assigned room. But yeah, for the school districts, you definitely get your holidays off. Every holiday. Yeah,
Mhm.
Columbus Day. I'm like, what? You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, they get these days.
Thanksgiving, Christmas. I think they get 4 weeks off for Christmas. They go back on the 8th, I think. The
Yeah.
kids do.
See, my oldest is back today. We got about
Mm.
2 weeks. And then my youngest goes back tomorrow.
Clemens, are you able to see the join button so that you can join a breakout room? Let me know if you can come off mute.
I'm sorry, can you repeat yourself?
I'm trying to see if Clemens can join the breakout room.
Uh,
Otherwise, at this point, we have less than a minute left. So
oh, sorry. Thought you were talking to
maybe
me.
no, you're good. I think we'll just have them hang in tight then. Got 30 seconds left on the clock.
It's funny, you know what, Danielle? When I go back home, when I go to Chicago, people used to make fun of me of my accent because I was in California for so long. They say I got an accent. I'm like, say what?
Right.
You talk so proper. Proper like what? English?
I get that a lot. My dad's from Birmingham, Alabama. So whenever I go to visit,
See?
it's always why do you
And
talk like that? Why do y'all sound
why you
like that?
talk like that? Every
Mm-hmm.
time I go back south, when I go to Alabama, um, I get that. Where you from?
Mm-hmm.
How you know I'm from someplace? How you know I'm from someplace
That's
else?
a thing. It's a thing. It's a
Every time.
thing.
It's so funny.
And
But there
everyone's
are
coming
dialects.
in. My apologies. Everyone is coming in back from the breakout rooms.
You are good. You are good. All right. Welcome back, everyone. I hope that you all had some good discussion. So I would love to hear from you all, just kind of thinking about what stood out about the questions. How's that parallel to your privileges? Feel free to chime in. We're going to practice what we talked about in the small group and the larger group.
Feel free to unmute yourself and just share because we had
Hi,
some good discussions. Go ahead.
hi everyone.
Hello.
Sorry, I'm a little sick coming off the holidays, so
Find the club, sister.
I'm like, I can do the speaker, but I'm not brave enough for a camera today. But
We get it. We get it. Thank you.
I know that we had some common experiences, not feeling, or maybe not so much not feeling wanted or not feeling safe, but definitely feeling like we're not the target demographic of a place.
Mm,
um Whether that's like a restaurant or that's a clothing store or just a neighborhood, and how that can make you feel really uneasy, or like you just can't, you're not wanted.
mm,
And on the flip side of that, like knowing that, um like I talked about my experience being like the a first generation American, so like Spanish was my first language, but I didn't develop an accent when I learned to speak English. So that's definitely something that I see as a privilege on my, like, that I definitely see as I've gotten older. Um so like not being asked if I need a translator. I 100% I'm aware of that, and then just kind of like comparing my experiences to my parents' experiences. And so I mean, we had a really good discussion. Everybody had some really great insight.
thank you for that. Yeah, I appreciate even paralleling your personal experience, right? So being a Spanish speaker, but maybe not necessarily having an accent, and what that experience is like, being able to kind of see and hear maybe conversations that are happening about those with accents. It's interesting when you're a part of a
Absolutely.
community. Okay. Hear from maybe one or two others on what your conversation was. How do you challenge your own privileges, or how did any of these things stand out to you?
I can go. I think that what stood out to me was that I definitely came to have that epiphany where it's like, oh, like I have privilege depending, like my privilege, I think status changes depending on the space that I'm in. So like being from the AV, I've always been surrounded by, like brown, black communities. And so I've always just felt, like normal. Like, I've always just felt
Yeah.
included. The only time in which I wouldn't feel like that was when, when I look at admin, staff, like teachers and people, that I was going like that, like where I saw other positions in which maybe I didn't see people that looked like us. And then I'm like, oh, okay. Now stepping out of my community here and going to, like college or going out in different spaces, that's where I definitely realized that it completely shifted just because
Mm,
a lot of the privilege was based on how I looked, right? Whereas like kind of like how Sandra said, like here in my community, I did realize I had privilege in the sense where I was able to advocate for my community, especially for those who didn't speak English. And then now over there in a different community, now it's like, well, I'm not being spoken to like if I can speak English, I'm being spoken to based on just my image. And
mhm.
so I definitely did think that that was interesting that just based on where you're at, your privilege definitely changes.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Yeah. And sometimes we forget, particularly when you come from a marginalized space, it is easy for us to be reminded of all the oppression that we experience. And that oppression is very real. Um, but it's also important for us to realize, like, man, this is what privilege looks like for me in this space, and the intersections of how those things are, and how they show up in our life. I see Emily in the chat. We focus a lot on the holiday aspect of privilege and how inequitable it is that some have to take time off and risk punishment, no pay to celebrate a holiday. That's a big deal, right? We like to tout in the US that we're the melting pot or the chopped salad, whichever euphemism that you want to go with, on what our country is made up of. But we are not totally a homogenous country. And so when we think about what it means to center certain holidays, what that means for me versus what that means for someone that doesn't celebrate those particular holidays, or someone that is burning through PTO to celebrate their cultural holidays or cultural backgrounds. And so uh, there's a lot of conversation on how vacation and PTO, maternity, paternity leave, caregiver leave, there's a lot of conversations there. And I think that that's a place where policy oppression meets systems, and how we see it. Obviously, people drive systems, people create policy, and that seeps into our systems and how things connect and work. So thank you all for, again, just engaging the conversation and see how our own privileges come up. one of the things that always comes up, which is interesting, some of the folks that are hosting this particular workshop, we were talking about books and being able to read in our home and access to books, access to library cards. And I know there's a big push here in USD 259, which is a school system that makes up Wichita specifically, which is the largest school system in our state. They have a push to say that we want every child reading at a proficient level by the third grade, and how that correlates to graduation rates. I heard not too long ago the importance of reading at least 1,000 books to your children before they hit kindergarten. That's a big deal, right? A, you have to have access to books. B, you have to have a reader, someone in the home, or a caregiver or a mentor, someone that has the time and the ability to do so. So just knowing what it means to be and get ahead in this community day. You all may have seen this before. This is a matrix of privilege and oppression. And we kind of talked about this a moment ago when we think about where we are, and maybe we're looking at our identities, and our identities intersect, but oftentimes we're boxed by an individual identity. So when you just think about your own standing, and you think about these identities, if you were to fill out this matrix and you looked at, what is your racial identity, your sex assigned at birth, your gender identity, religion, age, and maybe you see something, maybe something's missing. Maybe vocation is more salient to who you are, or your educational level, right? If you were to fill this out and you think about each of those identities and you think about the places and spaces you're in, are those identities for you oftentimes privilege? Do they lie at the border? Sometimes it's a privilege, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's a target, or is it always a target? And so just kind of thinking about your own identities and how those identities show up, right? Maybe as a woman on the job, is that a privilege for you? Being a woman at home, is that a privilege or a target? A woman jogging in the street, is that a privilege, a target, or border, right? Being a young person in the space, the youngest person in the space, the only Spanish speaker, the only brown complected looking person, the only outward facing immigrant. How do these things ebb and flow and change for you? So this is another way to kind of think about identity. And oftentimes we think about identity from the singular space, right? Like just one identity. There's another concept, kind of getting away from the privilege oppression in a singular identity focus to what is called the multidimensional model of privilege. So just thinking about all those identities that you just saw and thinking about them as always ongoing. For me, I identify as a woman, a mom, a biracial woman, a woman of color, a Black woman, a Filipino woman, a sister, a daughter, an executive director, a trainer. There's all these things that are happening all the time. And a gentleman by the name of Justin William Smith Ford says that privilege exists as a continuum with many dimensions rather than in discrete pockets, rather than just white privilege, just male privilege, just Christian privilege, whatever that is, that it's stepping out of that space to see it in a multi-dimensional view. So how are we interacting with privilege consciously and unconsciously? So this takes out, he states, instead of saying and singularizing or just putting into discrete pockets just white privilege, you would say racial privilege. You would say gender privilege. So getting out of the one singular focus to the larger kind of conversation about what privilege looks like. And there's kind of the thought process of, but how do you call out some of these other things if we're looking at it from a broader sense? And I don't always know how folks feel about, is it most important to say, hey, it's racial privilege versus white privilege, gender privilege versus male privilege? But very much he looks at it in this dimensional way, right? So this is privilege and this is the continuum. And we'll call this like the big eight, right? And there are more identities in this, but these are the things that generally come up the most or touch us all: aesthetic, racial, identity, orientation, socioeconomic status, gender, religion, citizenship, ability, and privilege is swirling through this continuum. And so when you're walking in your everyday life, if you're thinking about it on a continuum, maybe you're thinking about your privilege more ongoing. Any kind of thoughts about this particular model, instead of just thinking about it as Black privilege, white privilege, male privilege, female privilege, straight privilege, thinking about it on the continuum of privilege is always swirling, and how am I interfacing with it in general? Any thoughts? Any disagreement with the continuum versus thinking about in a siloed kind of pocketed way?
You know what, Danielle, when you said that, I see that it interacts, we all experience both privilege as well as, you know,
Mhm.
being um, discriminated against in some form or another. We've done it or participated in it knowingly or unknowingly,
Right.
you know? And when you think about it, it's like, and at different seasons in our life, we go through it. It's like when you say um, age, you experience different things at different seasons in your life, and opposed to, you know, when you're at one level and entering into the workforce, and then you're at another season in your life in the workforce. You see it.
Right.
Um, and we talked about the religious. You know, we get privileges. Like we said, we got the week off for Christmas, but some folks don't get that for their holiday seasons, whatever those their religious practices are. So I see that we are a part of this, and it's interesting when you look at it from a viewpoint where you're just stepping back and looking at it. So it's very interesting.
I think that this model might actually, like going off of what you were just saying, this model might be a better way of kind of um talking to people about privilege in a way that doesn't kind of get their guard up right away. Um, because I know that I'm for maybe for some people, I know growing up definitely before I kind of had a more a better understanding of the concept. Absolutely would be like, I'm a minority. What do you mean? Like, what do you mean privilege? I am also a minority, you know? But then it's like when you understand all of like just how circular this is, you know, all the different ways, it does give you a better understanding of things. But I think that this model is actually, I can see it as a way of having a starting a conversation in an easier way.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I mean, when you think about it in the larger, what's going to set someone off quicker, racial privilege or white privilege? I'm not saying don't have the conversation either way, but oftentimes you can coax people into getting a better understanding when you're bringing the whole conversation, but then being able to piece it out to say, but also with the example of the application or opportunities, right? You're also being able to piece that out. I see in the chat, Emily says, I think I find it interesting that they all hold the same weight, where societally we may place more weight on certain aspects of privilege. This is true, right? And I think we experience that more often than not, right? Like there's some things that we believe to be more important in the privilege discussion than others. Go ahead, Carla.
It makes me think of like when I'm walking around, depending on what room I enter, I can feel some of these a little bit heavier than others. And how sometimes just being around those who share similarities with myself, I feel comfortable and I feel like that's my privilege kicking in of like this is where I belong and this is where I am accepted and understood. And the minute I step out of that space and walk into something where I become a minority or I become the less represented, it's like, oh dang, how comfortable am I really to raise my hand, speak up, share ideas?
Mhm. That's big. Yeah. Right. If you look at every one of these things as a door, the spaces that you're actually in, how it shows up for you, the privilege and oppression. Absolutely. I was watching something as simple as, children that are part of ballet and finding slippers and stockings that match their skin tone. For some, they might think, well, that's not a big deal. But for others, it is when you're looking for matching makeup or matching pantyhose or things that other folks might have basic access to because it's assumed, right? Flesh color band-aids, those little things. When you step into a store or a space where you're going to spend your hard-earned money, you want to be represented. And when you're spending an additional hour to find clothes that fit your body, or to go to a movie theater, right? So any of these things where you want to be able to access space, what does that privilege look like? And what's lacking in those spaces? So just some additional scenarios for you to consider, and we'll just talk through these. Being reflective. How might your experience as an able-bodied person differ from the experience of a person with a disability? So think about what it's like for you to commute daily, or negotiating, you're planning the annual work dinner or the lunch for everyone. Are we asking the appropriate questions like, what are the food allergies? Right? Does everyone have access to transportation to get where we're going? How people interpret an expression of anger or frustration, right? Are we assuming, when we think about folks that maybe are autistic on the spectrum and what it means to showcase emotion in that way, are we considering everyone that's sitting at our tables that are part of our organizations? How might your experience as a professional livable wage earner differ from the experience of someone who is unemployed or underemployed, right? Many of us have jobs, but some of us aren't working in livable wage jobs, which causes some of us to work 3 and 4 and 5 jobs. So if we needed to respond to school requests for children's supplies, how would we do that? Right. Sometimes we hear, the teachers' lists are getting longer and longer. Schools' lists are getting longer and longer to send our children to school. However, how many caregivers are able to participate in the purchase of those lists for our kids to be successful in the classroom? Responding to an old acquaintance who wants to meet up for lunch. Many of us maybe get those lunch requests, and depending on what's in our pocket, do we have the dollars to meet the person for lunch? And those of us that are requesting to go to lunch for people, are we making an assumption of what people can afford? Answering a want ad for a job 60 miles away. I think this one's always stands out to me because there might be an opportunity for someone to get to that next level in their career. That's the job that they can quit all the other side hustles and work one job and have good benefits and be able to finally get into their first home, whatever that looks like. They can't even answer the job because they don't have the means to get to that 60-mile away organization. So what are our means day to day as we think about what we're able to bring into our homes? And some of us may be experiencing this very thing on the screen today. How much your experience as someone that is a cisgender heterosexual person differ from the experience of someone that is a part of the LGBTQ plus person in the following? And then here, just want to root us into some language. Cisgender meaning a person whose sense of personal identity and gender corresponds with their birth, sex assigned at birth. And then heterosexual meaning sexually or romantically attracted exclusively to people of the opposite sex. How does that differ in expressing affection, love, and comfort in public? Think about your partnerships. What does that look like? What does your safety look like when you're out with your family? Preparing to introduce your partner to your family, friends, and place of employment. Participating in a lunch discussion at work on what you did this weekend. How freely can you share who you are, who you love, who's a part of your families? These are things that come up day to day when we think about privileges and oppression. How authentically can we show up in conversations around people and places? There's just some opportunities for you all to kind of think about what does that look like for us day in and day out, thinking about privilege on the continuum and how we interact with the world. What does that mean for us and what our privileges look like? So I'm just going to read this verbatim. Anti-oppression principles and practices. Wildman and Davis explain that members of the privileged group gain many benefits by their affiliation with the dominant side of the power system, right? If you make up a majority in a space, then oftentimes you get to enjoy the spoils or the benefits of that, right? Right. We get to, if we celebrate Christmas and our jobs give us that time off, we celebrate the benefit, the privilege of being folks that get that time off, right? There may be who may receive deference, special knowledge, or a higher comfort level to guide societal interactions. Privilege is not visible to its holder. It is merely there as a part of the world and a way of life, simply the way things are. others have a lack, an absence, or deficiency of this, right? We start to believe that things are the norm when you're a part of the norm, when you're a part of the majority. Those that are not a part of that begin to feel, and I think as you said earlier, sometimes I walk into rooms, I'm not a part of the majority. I feel like I'm the odd man out. Something's weird about this. I'm starting to, I feel the difference. And that can kind of overtake the practices that are happening. So power and privilege can play out in our group dynamics in destructive ways. We must challenge supremacist ideas and marginalization that exclude or deal with others. And privilege and power can be used for positive purposes, but we have to be aware of what those are, right? If we're decision makers, if we're policy makers, what's our role in this work? Regardless of which group we're talking about, privilege generally allows people to assume a certain level of acceptance, inclusion, and respect in the world and to operate within a relatively wide comfort zone. Some folks get to walk around the world comfortable, while others are trying to find comfort zones. So when you reflect on how you just interact, how comfortable are you spending your day and your time? How often are you in the majority or enjoying the spoils of privilege? And what do we need to do to better engage and maybe disrupt these systems so that we're actually helping to move the marker forward or giving other opportunities for folks to engage in privilege? So some questions for you to ask yourself. How can we work to make sure that we are understanding and undermining the system of oppression and privilege that hurts all of us? What are the intersections of my privileges and how can I spread the wealth of privilege and power? Am I engaging in oppressive practices myself? You can be oppressed and be an oppressor, right? You can experience oppression and be someone that is also being oppressive. We have to be mindful that some of us are not gatekeepers and keeping others out of the spoils of the opportunities for fear of loss of our own position, right? Because in that only one in the room space, some folks enjoy being the only one in the room because they believe I'm going to lose some level of power if I let another brown person in here with me, if I let another woman on my leadership team, if I let another, whatever it is, fill in the blank. We have to be mindful of how we show up as well, how we advocate for others to share in the space. What am I aware of? What am I accountable for? What's in my sphere of influence? Some of us have a little bit more influence than others. How are we showcasing and showing up in those spaces to move the needle? And how do I equalize the playing field? And then I always like to add cultural humility. That's just an ongoing piece of how do we have a lifelong commitment to learning and critical self-reflection? What is our desire to fix power imbalances? What's in our control, what's not? Who are we proximate to? Maybe we're proximate to those that have the power to make the changes, write the policies, create the opportunities. How are we providing mentorship or coaching? Are we managing up if need be? Institutional accountability and mutual respect is important when we think about just having general trust. For you in your everyday practice, how are you checking your own privilege and being aware of it? Privilege is not innately bad. So I don't want folks walking away with guilt, blame, or shame, thinking, oh man, I have all these privileges. There's something wrong. No, the goal is for us all to enjoy privileges. It's how do we enjoy them responsibly and how are we engaging others in those spaces? So what are our everyday interactions with privilege? What are the workplace norms and expectations? Are we inadvertently leaving folks out based on policies that privilege folks? Maybe it's we always have these meeting times that are hard on our caregivers. We can't hear ideas from folks that can't make the meeting because they're always having to leave at 4:15 because that's when school gets out. So Darrell can never be there. Or we know that we always want to do something in the evening, but some folks need to spend some family time. So how are we engaging and choosing the most optimal time for our organization? When we're hiring, if we know that there is someone on the hiring team that gets uncomfortable when they see names that they can't pronounce, that we have to talk about that. We have to root that out. We have to have a conversation. We have to bring that up, right? If we're saying we are looking for folks that are bilingual, that just because someone works on the job that's bilingual, if we didn't hire them to do translation, that we're not just assuming and tapping them to do that work, but are we really making sure that we're appropriately paying folks for the talents and their values to the organization? That's important too, right? Sometimes we take advantage of the diversity we don't appropriately pay and or recognize. the talent that the diverse talent brings into our organization and company. Advancement in recognition, mentorship. I know something that's important to me is if I'm asked to serve on boards, I'm assessing what that board looks like. And when my term is up, how do I get 3 or 4 more folks that have some of my same identities that are qualified, right? Diversity doesn't mean lack of qualification. You still got to meet the qualification. We're also looking at what is missing at the table. What are the facets and the voices that are not there? So how can I ensure if we're working on youth policies, I need to be the person in the room that says, you know what, we're making rules and regulations for youth, but there ain't no youth at the table. How are we creating opportunities and or structure around groups of people and they're not represented? If you're doing houseless, homeless work, where are the houseless, homeless folks that are needing to get into the shelters? Are they at the table? It's privilege that brings us to tables to create policies and work. But when we're creating those policies, are we listening to the people and ensuring that the folks that we're creating these structures for are a part of the creation of their structure as well? That's utilizing your privilege in ways that are impactful day in and day out. Lastly, just something for you to consider in your personal impact statement, right? Because we don't just do this for the fun of it, but what are you going to do moving forward? In what ways can you be more aware of your privileges? How will you utilize your privilege to impact change for your community, your household, whatever place or space that you inhabit? How are you moving the needle forward? And what must you do to succeed in your commitment? So please be thinking about that. And in the next few months, right, we're at that New Year's time. So there's a bunch of resolutions. All of us are trying to have some self accountability, eat better, work out, all the things. And then we turn around 3 months later and it's like, oh, I forgot all the things. I'm back to old habits. How are we going to engage long term in new habits to create long term systemic changes? And if there are any questions, I will stay on. Darrell, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Danielle. Thank you so much. So if you have any questions, now is the time you could come off camera or unmute and just make a statement. Ask Danielle any questions. Now's the time to do that. We are coming to the conclusion of our time together, but we do have time for any last minute comments or questions. And if you want to drop something in the chat, we will read those. Oh, Emily said, I think I find it interesting that they all hold the same weight, where societally we may place more weight on certain aspects of privilege. Okay. Somebody agreed with that. So thank you, Emily. I don't know if we read that before, but thank you for sharing that. Any other comments or questions? If not, I see Gustavo trying to connect. Okay. I'm going to share my screen with you one more time. Oops. Again, you can use our QR code to sign in. If you have not done so already, if you came afterward, please sign in. I'm going to ask Omar to drop the sign-in link into the chat box again. For those of you who did not have the opportunity to do that before, or you can use this QR code and scan it. So our next topic next week on January 10th, our workshop topic will be the LGBTQ and inclusion. And we will have that. Danielle, will you be presenting that one or one of your cohort?
It will either be me or Shauna Siobhan Stevens.
Okay. All right.
All right. Thank you.
Again, here we go. Thank you for joining us today. If you have any last minute questions or comments, feel free to stay on and you can converse with Danielle. We have a few extra moments. If not,